In this exercise, we're going to work on the cleaned seam. On your pattern piece here, it's called the 3/4 inch cleaned to 1/2 inch. And we just need to cut one of these. So I'm going to lay out my fabric that I have. And notice on this fabric, I don't have a selvage here. So I just need to test it. Remember, if you don't have a selvage to guide your straight grain, which is this, needs to be aligned the straight grain. Remember that if you can pull on your fabric and you get some give, that must be the cross grain. And if you pull the fabric in the other way and there's no give or very little give, that must be your straight grain. So lay this flat, and I'm actually going to line this up just a little bit past the cut edge. I want to make sure it's straight. Try to align your grain line as straight as you can along that line. If you need to, put some weights on the paper. It isn't really necessary to pin this since we're just going to trace around it. I'm just going to trace around with my pencil. And notice that I'm using the pencil at an angle and I'm just butting it up against the side of the pattern. And then always come back to mark your notch. And now I can quickly cut this out. So now I have my piece cut. I'm just going to clip my notches. Again, this part probably seems redundant, but I want you to get used to using your notches. I'm going to use my ruler. I'm going to mark this line between the notches, and I'm going to use this line to cut down between the notches. Then I'm going to use a marking pen. I'm going to mark the face side of the fabric that I want to use. Then I will match these face to face. And if you desire, pin them in place. Now for this seam, as it's sewn, we're going to sew a 3/4 inch seam allowance all the way down, and then we will press it open. We're going to press a 1/4 inch back, and then we're going to stitch that seam allowance back. Now we're ready to go to the machine. Okay, so we're ready to sew our 3/4 inch seam clean to a 1/2 inch. And so we're going to start with our fabric. And here I actually have my fabric pinned, and I'm going to be removing those pins as I sew. So you can if it helps you to keep the fabric together, go ahead and pin. I just wanted to show this for demonstration purposes. So to clean our seam to a 1/2 inch, we're actually going to start with a 3/4 inch seam, and that's what we're going to sew here. So remember from the previous videos that we're actually going to place the fabric just under and past the needle under the presser foot. So I'm going to lift the presser foot. I'm doing a 3/4 inch seam, so I'm aligning my cut edges along that 3/4 seam and pushing it just past where the needle would enter. Presser foot down, needle down, and I'm going to start with the back stitch. So I'll sew, back stitch, and now I'm going to start sewing that seam. And I'm going to have to reach in here and grab those pins so that I don't sew over the pins. The reason we don't want to leave the pins in is because we might hit it with the needle, and that will either break our needle or it will put what's called a burr on it, and it will actually hurt the fabric. So we want to make sure that we're taking the pins out as we sew. get ready to backstitch and backstitch. And I'm clip my threads. So here's our 3/4 inch seam. We'll go ahead and measure it, but we're gonna actually need to do some pressing in order to clean this up. So let's go over to the pressing board. Okay, so for the 3/4 inch clean to 1/2 inch, we've sewn the 3/4 inch seam here. I'm just gonna give that a quick press to set those stitches. And then I'm going to bust it open. And I will press that flat. This keeps a nice flat seam. All right, and then what we're gonna do is we're gonna take each one of the layers of the seam allowance and we're going to press the edge over 1/4 inch. Now, if you need a ruler, you can go ahead and check that that's 1/4 inch. See if you can practice by eye all the way down. Now again, when we get done sewing this, we want to make sure that the finished seam allowance is still 1/2 inch. So now that I've got pressed that side, now I can grab the other seam allowance and I'm going to turn that in 1/4 inch. Just check just to eye it, and then we can eye it the rest of the way. Okay, so again, now what we've done is I pressed it, then I busted the seam open, and I'm turning the seam allowance toward the wrong side, actually, the wrong side of the seam allowance, 1/4 inch. And then when we get done, it will look similar to this, except we're gonna go to the machine and we're gonna top stitch this down so that will hold this down underneath the seam allowance. So I'll see you back at the machine. Okay, so to finish this clean seam allowance, remember we've turned it over, we pressed the seam allowance over 1/4 inch, and I'm just gonna fold the rest of the fabric away. And you could stitch on this side, the wrong side, to keep that folded, but we've pressed it really nicely, and I actually prefer to have the top stitching. The top stitch thread is actually a little bit nicer stitched than the bobbin thread. So I'm going to stitch here on the top, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to stitch about 1/8 of an inch away from this folded edge. So right about here, about the middle of what this folded over, because half of 1/4 is 1/8, so my stitching line will be about in the half of what I folded over. So you could probably mark with the pen if you'd like where the 1/8 inch is. So I'm just going to lift my presser foot up, and remember this line here where I have it lined up to is 1/4 inch, so I'm going to move that away about 1/8 of an inch and then slide this up under the presser foot. So if you can just kind of measure from this 1/4 inch line to the folded edge of the fabric, that should be about 1/8 of an inch. So put the needle down. I'm going to start off with a back stitch and then try to keep it as straight. And the way I look at it is I look at the distance from the line, and then I also look at this little rounded part of the foot. Let me see if I can point better with the snips. The rounded part of here, the top of that, so the middle of this little part of the foot here, I kind of like to eye that, and that's how I can get a really nice even stitch along the top. And I'm coming up to the end, and I'm getting ready to backstitch. Okay, so let's have a look at that. Okay, so that looks fairly even. Now we're actually going to fold all the fabric back the other way, and we're going to do the same thing on the other side. Okay, and we can have a look at this now really quick. Okay, the one thing that we want to look for is the consistency, that the stitch line is equal distant all the way down, and that both of these are about equal. They look the same from side to side. That's very important, especially if you're going to be doing custom work, that all of your stitching is consistent. And this is the face side, and now we'll give it one final press before we go to assessment.